Mom called me a failure and kicked me out, then gave my brother the house. 3 years later, my brother drove by my place and froze. He called Mom, shouting, "Mom, this house is worth, wait, it's his? My brother's?" What my mom did after that I never saw coming. My mother's mouth opened and closed twice before anything came out, and in that silence, I watched her do the thing she'd always done best, recalculate. I could see her running the numbers behind her eyes, the way she used to when I was a kid, and she'd catch me in a lie and decide, on the spot, whether punishing me was worth the scene it would cause. "Alex," she finally said, "where did you get that? Not what is that? Not I don't understand." She knew exactly what she was looking at. Her voice had dropped into the register she used on collection calls, back when I was young enough to still be listening through the wall. "The excavation crew found it," I said. "June of last year, under what used to be a concrete footing, about 4 feet down. Steel box, sealed with roofing tar. My foreman thought it was some kind of old utility marker and almost had it hauled off with the fill dirt." I held up the folded blueprint sheet again, the one with the corner soft and gray from 30 years in the ground. "It's dated March 2006, Mom. 7 months before Dad's accident." She flinched at the word accident like I'd slapped her with it. "You don't know anything about that," she said. "You were 15. I know he fell off a utility pole in a storm. I know he was in a coma at St. Agnes for 19 days. I know that by the time he woke up, this land had already been sold back to the Millers for $52,000. And I know your name is the only one on the deed. I had power of attorney. I had to make decisions. You had emergency power of attorney," I said, "for medical decisions, not to liquidate a piece of property he'd spent 4 years' worth of savings on while he was still unconscious." She looked past me, toward the gate, toward Leo's Mercedes still idling with the door open like he hadn't decided whether he was staying for this. Then she looked back at me, and something in her face tried on an old expression, the wounded mother look, chin tucked, eyes wet, the same one she'd worn my whole childhood, right before she rewrote whatever had just happened into a story where she was the only person who'd ever suffered. "Your father left us," she said. "He left you boys. I raised you both alone." "He didn't leave," I said. "You moved us 40 minutes away while he was still relearning how to talk. And then you told everyone, including me, that he walked out." I hadn't planned to say any of it that fast. I'd imagined, in the 18 months since the steel box came up out of the ground, that I would sit her down somewhere controlled, a lawyer's conference room maybe, with documents laid out in order, the way you'd want a surgeon to explain a diagnosis. Instead, I was doing it on my own front steps, with my brother's car door chiming behind me, and my mother's hand still gripping the stone railing like the ground had tilted. "Is he?" she said, and stopped, started again. "Is he alive?" I didn't answer that yet. I wasn't ready to give her that. "Get off my property," I said instead. "You'll hear from my attorney." I should explain the box, because for the first 11 months I owned that land, I had no idea what I was standing on. I bought the 7 acres from a man named Gary Miller in February of last year. An easy, boring transaction, the kind you don't think twice about. Gary was 71, recently widowed, tired of paying property tax on a parcel his family had held since before he was born, cut loose except for a stretch in the middle they'd sold off and later bought back. He told me that much himself, standing in his kitchen with a mug of instant coffee going cold. We had it, then we didn't, then some fella's situation went bad and we picked it back up cheap in '06. Been sitting empty since. He didn't know the fella's name. He was maybe 9 years old when it happened and it wasn't his family's business to remember. I didn't ask more. I was thinking about solar exposure and soil percolation, not history. Construction started that April. My general contractor, a woman named Priya Nair, who'd built 2 other net-zero homes in the county, ran into the old footing in June, the remains of a workshop foundation, abandoned mid-pour, nothing but a rectangle of cracked concrete choked in blackberry roots. We were going to break it up anyway to lay the geothermal loop. That's when her crew hit the box. I didn't open it for 3 weeks. I want to be honest about that, because it says something about who I'd become by then, or maybe who I'd always been. I was mid-negotiation with a utility co-op in Oregon, sleeping 4 hours a night, and a rusted steel box felt like someone else's problem. I set it on a shelf in my garage between paint cans and forgot about it until a Sunday in July, when I had nothing to do, and the quiet of the house started to feel less like peace and more like a dare. Inside were 4 things: a rolled sheet of vellum with hand-drawn schematics for what the notes called a modular off-grid renewable system, solar and microwind paired through a custom inverter, sketched with the kind of confidence that comes from someone who'd already built it in his head 100 times. A spiral notebook, water-damaged at the edges, filled with calculations in a cramped, slanted hand. A Polaroid of a man in his early 30s, standing in front of a half-poured foundation, squinting into the sun, one boot up on a cinder block, grinning like he'd just been handed the rest of his life, and a letter, sealed in a freezer bag that had somehow held. To whoever finishes this, it started and then, Crossed out, to my sons, when the workshop is done. I read it 4 times before I understood what I was holding. The man in the photograph was my father. I recognized him the way you recognize a stranger who happens to share your exact jaw and your exact way of standing with his weight on one hip. I hadn't seen a picture of him since I was maybe 11. My mother had removed them all sometime around when I turned 13. Quietly, the way she removed most things she decided not to talk about. The notebook's margin, on a page dated February 2006, had 4 letters written and underlined twice, M-O-R-E under it, modular, off-grid, renewable, everywhere. His shorthand for the whole idea. Build small, build clean, build something that could scale into anything. I'd had that plaque made for my own gate 8 months before I found the box. I told the fabricator I wanted 1 word, no explanation, because it was the thing I told myself every time a client turned me down for 2 years straight. There's more where that came from. Build more. Prove more. I had never once in 35 years heard my father say that word out loud to me, and there it was, buried 4 feet under my own foundation, in his handwriting, 20 years before I chose it for mine. That's the part I couldn't explain to anyone, not even the 2 professionals I eventually paid to explain everything else. The letter didn't say where he'd gone, because he hadn't gone anywhere yet when he wrote it. It was a young father's letter, written 7 months before the fall that would take the rest of his plans away from him, full of plans for a workshop he never finished, a place where he'd teach Leo and me to wire a circuit board, where we'd camp out under a tin roof he was going to build with his own hands, and I remember this line exactly because I've read it more times than I can count now. Your mother thinks I'm chasing something that isn't real, but I want you boys to know it's real. I've done the math 4 times. It works. Someday it's going to be the most ordinary thing in the world, and I want us to be the ones who made it ordinary. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my kitchen, the kitchen in the house I'd built on the land he'd bought, and I did something I hadn't done since I was a teenager. I let myself wonder whether he was alive. I told myself for 2 weeks that it was probably nothing. People sell land in a divorce all the time. Maybe he'd agreed to it. Maybe the story I'd grown up with, your father couldn't handle being a husband or a father, he chose to leave, was simplified but not false. I'd built a company on the discipline of not chasing ghosts. I told myself this was a ghost. Then I drove to the county recorder's office on a Tuesday morning and asked a clerk named Denise Farrow to pull the deed history on parcel 14092-700. She printed it without comment, the way clerks do, and handed it across the counter, and I stood there in a beige hallway that smelled like toner and read a quitclaim deed executed November 2nd, 2006, transferring the 7 acres from Daniel R. Marsh to Walter G. Miller for the sum of $52,000. The grantor's signature line read, Daniel R. Marsh, by Carol A. Marsh, attorney in fact, notarized by a Linda J. Faust, commission number stamped clean and legible. My hands weren't steady enough to hold the paper flat. I set it on the counter and photographed it instead. I went back 2 days later for the probate file. Thornfield County still keeps guardianship petitions on microfiche past a certain year, and it took Denise almost 40 minutes to find the reel. Case number GD 2006-0341, in re the conservatorship of Daniel R. Marsh, filed October 14, 2006, 5 days after the accident. Emergency temporary order granted the same week, citing his medical incapacitation, which was, on its face, true. He had been in a coma. What the file didn't show anywhere was a follow-up hearing, a review, a termination, not until a separate filing 3 years later in March 2009, from a different case number entirely, one attached to a family court docket instead of probate. That's where I found Dr. Aaron Petrosian's name for the first time. Independent neuropsychological evaluation, court-ordered as part of a custody proceeding, dated February 2009. Conclusion, typed in the flat clinical language that somehow hit harder than anything dramatic could have. Mr. Marsh presents with residual expressive language deficits consistent with his 2006 traumatic brain injury. He demonstrates full orientation, intact executive function, and the capacity to manage his own affairs and to safely parent. No ongoing need for conservatorship is indicated. The conservatorship was terminated the following month. By then, my mother had already moved Leo and me 40 minutes away to Brookhaven Heights, already told the boosters at Leo's school and the other mothers at my elementary and both sets of grandparents that Daniel had some kind of breakdown and walked away, already built 3 years of quiet distance into something that, by the time a judge said he was fine, looked from a 15-year-old's chair like the truth had already been decided. I sat in my car in the recorder's office parking lot for a long time that afternoon. I want to say I cried. I didn't. Not then. What happened was closer to what happens when you stand up too fast. A kind of white static, my pulse in my ears, my stomach doing something I didn't have a word for until my doctor gave me one a few weeks later. A stress response. Appropriate given what you're describing. I called an attorney the next morning. Warren Island had spent 16 years doing property and title litigation out of a two-lawyer firm on Fenwick Street, the kind of practice that mostly handled boundary disputes and easement fights. Warren Island had spent 16 years doing property and title litigation out of a two-lawyer firm on Fenwick Street, the kind of practice that mostly handled boundary disputes and easement fights, which meant he read a fraudulent quitclaim deed the way most people read a grocery list, quickly and with total certainty about what he was looking at. Two problems here, he told me, tapping the printout with the end of his pen on our first meeting. One, an attorney in fact acting under an emergency medical POA doesn't have authority to convey real property unless the instrument specifically grants it, and I'd bet you a year of billing this one didn't. Two, he flipped to the notary stamp, held it under a desk lamp, and went quiet for a second. This commission number, give me a week. It took him 4 days. Linda Faust's notary commission, according to the Secretary of State's archived registry, had lapsed on August 30th, 2006, 2 months before she stamped a document dated November 2nd. She'd let it expire and kept using the old stamp anyway, which happens more than anyone likes to admit in small towns, where everyone knows everyone and nobody checks. Warren pulled her old business filings. She and my mother had pledged the same sorority in college 30-some years earlier. They were still, according to a public Facebook photo from a reunion 3 summers ago, close enough to be standing arm in arm. That's not proof of collusion by itself, Warren said, the way lawyers hedge everything, but it's the kind of thing a jury remembers. He referred me to a forensic document examiner in the state capitol, Dr. Renee Okafor, board certified through the American Board of Forensic Document Examiners, 14 years in practice. Most of her caseload split between will contests and insurance fraud. I mailed her the original quitclaim deed, along with 3 exemplars of my father's authentic signature that Warren's paralegal had pulled from an old union card, a 1998 W-2, and, this one took some doing, a 2005 building permit application for the very workshop whose foundation now sat under my geothermal loop. Her report came back 6 weeks later, 11 pages, heavy with the hedged, careful language forensic examiners use, because a courtroom will hold them to every word of it. Her conclusion, stripped of the methodology, the signature on the 2005 building permit and the 3 exemplar signatures showed consistent formation, pen pressure, and letter slant. The signature on the 2006 quitclaim deed, Daniel R. Marsh, by Carol A. Marsh, was not, in her professional opinion, an authentic representation of an attorney-in-fact signing on a principal's behalf in the conventional form. The letter formation in Daniel R. Marsh itself, she wrote, showed indicators of simulation. Someone had attempted imperfectly to trace or approximate his signature rather than sign her own name as agent, the way the instrument actually required. In plain terms, Dr. Okafor told me on the phone, in the gentlest voice I'd heard from a stranger in weeks, whoever signed this didn't sign it the way the form allowed them to. They signed it as him. That's not attorney-in-fact conduct. Depending on your state statute, that's forgery. I sat with that phrase for 3 days before I did anything else. I hired a private investigator before I let myself hope for anything. Marisol Vance had spent 19 years with the Kessler County Sheriff's Office, 9 of them in the Detective Bureau before she went private, and her office, 1 room above a dry cleaner, had exactly the kind of unglamorous competence I needed. I told her I wanted to know if my father was alive, and if he was, I wanted to know everything, and I wanted to know it before I told my brother a single word, because I didn't trust myself yet to be right. It took her 11 days. Daniel Marsh, 54 years old, was living in a rented 1-bedroom above a hardware store in a town called Cedar Ridge, 90 minutes north, where he'd worked the parts counter for the last 6 years. He was on partial disability from the accident. His left hand still didn't close all the way, and he wore a hearing aid in his left ear from nerve damage the fall had caused, but he wasn't incompetent, wasn't unstable, wasn't any of the words my whole childhood had quietly trained me to expect. Marisol's report included a photograph she'd taken from across the street, long lens, apologetic in her email about the intrusion. He was standing outside the store in a canvas apron, laughing at something a customer said, one hand braced on a shopping cart. He looked exactly like the man in the Polaroid, 20 years older, same jaw, my jaw. There's something else, Marisol told me the day she handed over the file, sliding a manila folder across her desk like she wanted it out of her hands as fast as possible. He filed for a custody hearing in 2009, Right after the conservatorship lifted, I found the docket. And I found something in his belongings. Well, not his belongings. His neighbor mentioned it. An older woman named Ruth Okafor. She caught herself. No relation to your document examiner, small world. She said he used to ask her every year right around your birthday and your brother's whether she'd seen any Marsh boys move into town. Said he sent cards for a few years. Never got anything back. I asked her not to contact him yet. I needed one more week to decide if I was the kind of person who could do this right. I drove up to Cedar Ridge on a Thursday, alone, and I sat in my car across from the hardware store for 40 minutes before I could make myself walk in. When I finally did, he was behind the counter, ringing up a bag of deck screws for an old man in a Carhartt jacket, and he glanced up out of habit the way retail people do, and something in his face went still. "Can I help you find something?" he said, and then he stopped talking because I hadn't moved, and I watched him actually look at me. Not a customer's face, a face, and I watched 20 years fall off him in about 4 seconds. "Alex," he said, "just my name, nothing else." His voice cracked on the second syllable. I didn't say anything for a while, neither did he. The old man in the Carhartt jacket took his screws and left without either of us noticing. We talked for 6 hours that day, in the back room of the hardware store, sitting on overturned paint buckets because there wasn't anywhere else to sit. He told me things I already half knew from the documents, and things no document could have told me. What it felt like to wake up in a hospital bed, unable to make his mouth form the word water. What it felt like 3 years later to sit in a courtroom and have a judge tell him that even though a doctor had cleared him, moving his sons back across a district line wasn't in their established interest. What it felt like to keep a shoebox of returned birthday cards in a closet for a decade because he couldn't bring himself to throw away the stamps. "I stopped fighting when you were about 17, he told me. "Not because I stopped wanting you, because every time I tried, your mother's lawyer made it cost more than I had, and I started to believe maybe you boys were better off without the fight showing up on your doorstep every few months. I told myself that was a kindness. I don't know anymore if it was a kindness or a coward's math." I told him about the land, about Gary Miller and the sale price and the deed with his forged name on it. I watched him go very quiet, the particular quiet of a man doing arithmetic he'd never let himself do before, and then I told him about the box. He put both hands over his face when I described the letter. He didn't cry the way people cry in movies. It was smaller than that. His shoulders came down, and he made one sound, low, like something had finally been set down after 20 years of carrying it. "I forgot I wrote that," he said when he could talk again. "I forgot I buried it. I was going to dig it up the day we finished the roof." "You built MORE, I told him. "I put it on my gate. I didn't know it was yours until I found the notebook." He looked at me like I'd told him something impossible. Telling Leo was harder than either of the 2 hardest conversations I'd already had. I asked him to meet me for lunch on a Wednesday, at a diner neither of us had been to before, Neutral Ground. And I brought Warren's file and Dr. Okafor's report and a printed copy of the letter, and I laid it all out on the table between the ketchup and the napkin dispenser like I was diffusing something. He didn't believe me, not at first. I watched him go through the exact motions our mother had gone through on my front steps, recalculating, looking for the angle, deciding this was some kind of attack on her rather than a fact about their father. "You've built this whole story," he said, "off one letter you found in the dirt. Mom raised us alone, Alex. She worked 2 jobs some years. You don't remember because you were a kid, but I remember." "I remember too," I said. "I remember her telling us he left. I have a forensic document examiner's report saying somebody forged his signature on a deed while he was in a medically induced coma. I have a court record showing a doctor cleared him in 2009, and she moved us before he could use it. Those aren't stories, Leo. Those are exhibits." He didn't speak for a long moment. Then he asked the question that told me he was starting to crack, even if he wasn't ready to admit it. Is he doing okay, Dad? Not is it true. Is he doing okay?" Some part of my brother, underneath 30 years of our mother's version of events, had never fully stopped being someone's son. "He works at a hardware store," I said. "He asked about you first, before he asked about me. Leo didn't come with me the following week, but he called our father's number, the one I gave him on a napkin, hands not quite steady, at 11 o'clock that night, and they talked for 50 minutes, and when Leo told me about it the next day, he wouldn't look at me while he said it, the way you avoid eye contact with someone who's just watched your whole floor cave in. The Thornfield Chamber of Commerce announced its annual Founders Circle dinner for the 2nd Saturday in September, a black tie fundraiser at the old Grange Hall that had, over the 15 years my mother had chaired its planning committee, become the closest thing our small town had to a coronation. That year's honoree, Printed on the program in gold script 6 weeks before the event was Carol Marsh, being recognized as the Chamber's Woman of the Year for 2 decades of civic philanthropy, including, the irony was not lost on me once I read it, funding the town's first playground renovation with money that, according to Deborah's numbers, could be traced almost exactly to the difference between $52,000 and what that land had actually been worth. I had 5 days between $2,000 and what that land had actually been worth. I had 5 days between the moment Leo told me the program had gone to print and the dinner itself. Warren was still finalizing a civil complaint, quiet title and fraud, filed but not yet served, and Dr. Okafor's report needed one more signature to be admissible as a certified exhibit, and my father, when I called to ask if he'd consider coming, went quiet on the phone for so long I thought the call had dropped. "I haven't been in that room in 20 years, he finally said. His breathing had gotten heavier over the phone the last few weeks. His doctor had mentioned, gently, that his heart wasn't what it used to be. One more thing the accident had cost him down the line, and I could hear him working to keep his voice even. I don't know if I have it in me to walk into a room full of people who believed I abandoned my own children. You don't have to say a word, I told him. You just have to be there. My mother, it turned out, wasn't waiting quietly for the dinner to arrive. Marisol picked up a call 3 days before the event. Carol Marsh had phoned Gary Miller directly, the first contact between them in almost 20 years, and according to Gary's own account, given freely to Marisol because he was, in his words, getting too old to carry somebody else's secret. My mother had asked him to say, if anyone ever asked, that the 2006 sale had been Daniel's idea, arranged before the accident. Nothing unusual about it at all. Gary told her no. He told her, he said, that he'd wondered for 20 years why a man who'd poured his own foundation with his own hands would sell the dirt out from under it while he still couldn't talk, and that he wasn't going to lie about it to protect anybody at 71 years old with nothing left to lose. 2 days before the dinner, Leo called me at 6:40 in the morning, his voice tight in a way I'd never heard from him. Our mother had shown up at his house the night before, he said, in tears, telling him I was trying to destroy this family out of some kind of jealousy, that I'd always resented Leo for the house, that I was using Dad as a weapon. She'd asked Leo to talk me out of coming to the dinner at all, or at the very least to keep our father away from it. What did you tell her? I asked. I told her I'd already talked to a lawyer of my own, Leo said. I told her I read the report. I told her I wanted to hear her explain the notary stamp before I decided whose side I was on. He paused. She hung up on me, Alex. 20 years, and the second I asked her a real question, she hung up on me. The Grange Hall on the second Saturday of September was full by 7, round tables draped in white, a jazz trio in the corner, the whole town's version of glamour turned up as far as it went. I watched from the back, near the coat check, in a suit I'd bought for the occasion and hadn't worn since. My father sat beside me in a chair Priya Nair had helped me borrow with an armrest sturdy enough for his weaker hand. Leo stood on his other side, in a tie I recognized from our own childhood photographs, the last one where all 4 of us had stood together before everything split. My mother took the small stage at 8:15 in a navy dress, accepting a glass plaque from the chamber president for 2 decades of quiet generosity to this community. She was good at this. She'd always been good at this. The practiced humility, the hand pressed to her chest, the line about how none of it would have been possible without the strength you find when life doesn't go the way you planned. I let her finish the sentence. Then I stood up. I didn't shout. I'd promised myself, driving over, that I wouldn't give her the version of this scene where I looked unhinged and she looked wronged. I walked to the edge of the small stage and I said her name, and the room turned, table by table, the way a room does when it senses something is about to happen that it will talk about for years. Before everyone leaves tonight, I said, I think this town should meet the man whose land actually made a lot of this possible. My father stood up, slowly with Leo's hand under his good arm, but he stood, and he walked the length of that room in front of 300 people who'd spent 20 years believing he'd walked out on his own family. And I watched faces I recognized from my childhood, teachers, neighbors. The man who used to run the hardware store before my father, coincidentally, ended up working in one just like it 90 minutes away. I watched every one of them do the same thing I'd done in that county recorder's hallway 3 months earlier, recalculate. My mother's face did not go pale slowly, the way it had on my porch. It went pale all at once like someone had cut the power. Daniel, she said, into a microphone she'd forgotten was still live. Hello, Carol, he said. His voice shook, but it held. I understand you've had my land for a while. I'd like it back. I'm not going to pretend the whole room understands understood everything in that instant. But Priya Desai, a staff reporter for the Thornfield Gazette who'd been covering the dinner for the paper's Sunday Society page, was sitting at table 6 with a notebook already out, and by the time she'd finished asking my father 4 careful questions and photographing the quitclaim deed I'd brought in a manila folder, because some part of me, the part that builds things for a living, had wanted proof in the room, and not just accusation, she had the outline of a story that would run above the fold the following Thursday under the headline, "The Land They Said He Left Behind." The chamber president, a mortified man named Ellis Grow, who'd introduced my mother 12 minutes earlier as a pillar of the community, asked her quietly to return the plaque. She did not argue. She set it down on the linen tablecloth and walked out through the side door, and nobody stopped her, and nobody followed her, and I remember thinking that was its own kind of verdict. A room full of people who'd known her for 20 years, and not one of them moved to comfort her. The chamber rescinded the award formally the following week. Linda Faust surrendered her notary commission to the Secretary of State's office rather than contest a fraud referral. Warren tells me the referral is still working its way through the county prosecutor's office, and that Thornfield County's discovery rule tolling means the statute of limitations on the deed fraud likely didn't start running until the day I found that steel box, which gives the prosecutor, a woman named Miriam Cole, who's held the office for 11 years, room to actually bring a case if she chooses to. Warren's civil suit, quiet title, fraud, unjust enrichment, settled 4 months later, not for money my father particularly wanted, but for a signed, notarized, publicly recorded correction to the chain of title, restoring his name to the parcel's history the way it should have read since 2006. My mother paid the settlement out of the retirement account she'd built partly on that $52,000, which felt less like justice and more like arithmetic, finally closing a loop that should have closed 20 years ago. Leo didn't speak to our mother for 5 months. When he finally did, it was a single supervised lunch, at his insistence, with his wife present, and he told me afterward that he'd asked her one question, whether she'd ever, in 20 years, considered telling us the truth herself, and that she'd answered by talking about how hard those years had been for her, and never once actually answered the question. He hasn't gone back since. He still lives in the house she gave him. He calls it now the house Dad built the down payment for, and I don't think he means it kindly. My father lives in a small cottage on the northeast corner of my 7 acres now, close enough to hear the wind turbine and far enough to have his own door to close when he wants quiet. Priya's crew built it in under 3 months, working weekends, because half the guys on her framing team had heard the story by then and wanted, in their words, to be part of finishing something that got interrupted 20 years ago. He works with me most days, not because Vidian Dynamics needs another engineer, though it turns out it did, more than I knew, but because there's a workshop standing now where the old foundation used to be, finished, roofed, wired, exactly where his half-poured slab sat abandoned for 20 years. We keep his original notebook on a shelf above the workbench, water damage and all, next to a newer one where he's picked up, almost exactly where his math left off. The gate still says more. I never changed the plaque. I didn't need to. Everyone who drives up that road now knows exactly whose word it was first. He asked me once, a few weeks after he moved in, sitting on the cottage porch with a cup of coffee going cold in his good hand, whether I'd ever regretted finding that box, whether some nights I wished the crew had just hauled it off with the fill dirt like the foreman almost did. I told him the truth. I told him that for 11 months I'd stood on that land and thought I'd built something entirely my own, out of nothing, out of spite, out of every rejection I'd ever swallowed, and that finding his letter hadn't taken that away from me. It had just shown me where it came from. There's more where that came from, I said, and for the first time in 20 years, I watched my father laugh at his own words coming back to him, in a voice that finally sounded like it belonged to somebody who'd gotten to keep the life he was supposed to have.